And before we get started, I have the usual off ball, but not that far off ball contribution. And somebody did an equivalent of an obsidian graph for the however many million it is English Wikipedia articles.
Oh,
And he
you
did
mean
a
a
short
graph view
video.
that showed the connections?
So um,
Oh, let me open the chat.
it, it uses
What you are looking
mostly, I think,
at is your
because I haven't
reference
finished watching it all completely,
a website that I can.
the bit at the bottom where all the linkages to the groups and the pages that are above or below that group.
Interesting.
So the Canadian one, there's a Canadian, what he calls community, that talks about Canadian politics and ice hockey,
Huh.
and that's it. Which is, I suppose, understandable. But there doesn't seem to be one speaks about English or British politics and cricket
Five
or
words
soccer,
you
but never
pronounced
mind.
wrong 2 years before you.
So it tweaked my interest. And one of the first things he says, like about 1 minute in, is there's so many dots on this graph, you can't do anything with it. But he then says,
Right.
where he's gone round and obviously applied some sort of tag and coloured each tag for what he's calling communities. Is you get this Milky Way type blob, but with different colours.
Yeah, it looks like those early maps of the internet from the early 2000s.
Yeah. But it still doesn't get you what's the linkage between
Yep.
Abraham Lincoln and Queen
And
Victoria.
Fanta cakes. Right.
Whatever.
Yep. I know Fanta cakes are a big factor at the end. Yep. Yeah, that'll be interesting. Thank you. Thank you. I haven't seen that before. I have gotten back onto YouTube, so I probably will start being a consumer of more YouTube as well as a contributor. So yeah, I'll check that out. Thank you. Yeah, I actually used that. I don't know if I talked about it or posted about it. The Milo Rossi little talk that he did at Virginia Tech. I used it last week with my students to try to sort of make the case for I guess kind of for what I'm doing, but also, to suggest that, maybe they might want to think about being media, not only more media literate, but more sort of productive of stuff. So, that's interesting. So what I was thinking about actually as I was kind of waiting, sitting here waiting to get going this morning was really the major thing was the next book. And because we're kind of done with this, and this one ended, I think, for me a little bit quicker than I kind of anticipated it was going to. It was just like bam, it was over. Deliverance, Bubba, that's it. Which I guess is okay. The one, so I'm looking through, and people have been sort of updating the book suggestions thing. I've been sort of feeling like I should step back a little bit from sort of exerting my will on everybody, because if that were the case, then we'd do The Dream of Democratic Culture, the Tim Lacey book next. But I'm going to read that anyway. So I will either, talk with you guys about it, or I will make videos about it. The one that sort of jumps out at me in the list is kind of this Capital Order, the Clara Mattei recent 2022 book. The only thing that I would say about that is it looks very European. It has a lot of votes. It has Pat, John, Tim, Eric and Chris and I have now voted for it as well. So, we could do it. I don't know that it would be a quick, I mean, I think it would probably be a fairly quick one because it doesn't seem to be that huge. And it does seem to be very much about, Italy and European austerity and stuff like that. But that might be, you know, if we historicize that, that might be, kind of interesting and relevant too. So, do we want to do that? Pat's giving a thumbs up.
I'm game for it.
All right.
Although I will too say that um, I'm just as big on the Lacey book, and we have presumed because of its expense is the reason not to.
And now it's
And I think we should
available
just
in the
take that
dot
off
drop
the table.
version. So we can pirate.
And yeah, but I would say we should leave that off as the motivating factor and see what the thought is to do it or not do it. But the Mattei book I think was interesting because it does present such a European perspective, particularly as it relates to fascism.
Yeah.
And we don't use the word austerity in the United States, really. It's almost always a European framing.
That's true.
We have what we would consider austerity in the United States, but we frame it a different way. And I'm kind of curious why we do that and what the impact is. And I think it, in an interesting way, speaks to the tail end of this book.
I would
of the
imagine
issue
you're right.
Patrick had stated that, where are we now? What's going on?
I suspect there's a lot to that. One of the things that I think we'll find interesting is when I think of European austerity, I generally think of, sort of the things that the World Bank imposed on Greece, and sort of the Greek response rather than, sort of the richest nations, Italy, Germany, Britain, sort of.
Yeah, and I think
imposing
mostly
that on
Britain and the Tory governments of the last 30 years or 20 years in the UK.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, and that might be,
there's
and
what
that
is it,
might
Jonas
go right
Varoufakis?
to this sort of class thing that we've been
Yeah.
exploring. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of good literature from the left anyway on the Greece experience.
Yep. Yep. Okay, then let's do that. I am the thing that I'm looking at right now doesn't have it. It's a Kindle preview, so it didn't have page numbers, but I can't imagine. I mean, it's 10 chapters, and I'm guessing we're looking at a couple of weeks.
Goodreads claims 480 pages.
Okay, well, maybe 3-4 weeks then. We could, yeah, I suppose we could. Part 1 is maybe of a piece, and then yeah. Okay, cool. Then that's what we'll do. I will get myself a copy of it.
The one other one that struck me too, and maybe it was in part because of Patrick's commentary on the tail end of this book, was Desmond, one or the other of Desmond's 2 books. He wrote Evicted, and then his more recent one is Poverty by America. But he's looking at things, and I think the tough part that Patrick's criticism of this hits is she's a historian who's looking at more at the past, and historians generally don't like to look at the last decade or more of, it's not done yet enough for a historian to write about the last 10 years. So the majority of what she is doing is creating the trail up to now, whereas Desmond is a sociologist and is primarily talking about now not so much how we got here, but here's where we are, and here are some of the reasons why.
Mhm.
So sociologists are a little more likely to say something about the here and the now than they are, and a little less about the past. So you almost have to put the two together to,
Yeah.
make the full puzzle come together. But I have a feeling, and Evicted and Poverty by America have both been on my list for a long time. And I feel more motivated now after having read this and some of the stuff we read on American myths and politics recently
Mhm.
as a potential answer for at least that subsection of how we treat the poor and what's going on and why.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah. It's
something to think about for both for now and off in the future.
mhm. Yeah. What do you think about that, Pat?
I would go with poverty or what we just decided. Either one would be fine with me.
Yeah. Okay. I was relooking
Your
at
interest in poverty.
I was kind of oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Did I cut you off? I was actually going through my, my Kindle library and thinking about, things I want to dip into to kind of remake my course for the fall. And two of the things that sort of jumped out at me were the Thomas Frank book, The People Know, and oh, there's my thumbs up, AI. Uh, and the other one was the Matt Stoller book Goliath, about monopoly. So I don't know, maybe those things will kind of find their way in. I gotta say that um, I think you're giving Nancy Isenberg some sort of space here, Chris, um, and sort of kind of excusing her a little bit. I didn't love this ending. I really, as a um, I don't know, and it's kind of weird. It made that maybe just be sort of an artifact of kind of where I'm at, but it struck me, and I did get her. I got a pile of books over there from the library. I did get her one of her recent books, and I am going to look at it. Um, I'm not. I just wasn't. I wasn't thrilled with this. And and it's kind of funny because I also started listening to Fareed Zakaria's book, audiobook, because it seems to deal with kind of what's going on today, and sort of historicizing that. And he
Wait, which Zakaria book?
it's called Age of Revolutions.
Village world of stability and security.
Okay.
It's this one here, and I don't, and I'm not recommending it. It's called Age of Revolutions. It's subtitled Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present, and the thing that I found interesting about it was that he sort of the revolution that he sort of begins with is the Dutch Revolution, right? And then so the first chapter is about the Netherlands rebelling against the Habsburg Spanish Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire, because Charles was the emperor and the king, but also and then he sort of moves on to he goes from sort of William the Silent to of Orange, to William of Orange, who opened the dikes and then became King of England in the Glorious Revolution. So I think the second chapter, which I've just begun, is on the Glorious Revolution. And I don't think that at this point I have noticed anything that I can say is sort of deliberately misleading in the sense of, other things that I've read, histories of cherry-picked events by, Glenn Beck and his ghostwriter Balfi, or things like that. But I do it did sort of strike me that, that the past is so big and is so filled with stuff that you can sort of thread a path that leads you to any conclusion or confirms any hypothesis. And so I think that's very, I've been thinking about that in the last week or so, just about this whole project of explaining the present in terms of the past, and and how much it depends on what you think the present is and what you think its problems are and its potential solutions. And that applies to me, I suppose, as well as anybody else. But I've been a little bit more sensitive to that. So Eisenberg's thing, her project in this section. So we move from kind of this Elvis moment and and LBJ with, the people on the front porch to this whole kind of redneck roots and identity politics and deliverance section. How do we feel about this?
My issue, I think, is she accelerated more rapidly as she went through. So there's more time spent to early history, a little bit to the middle last 100 years, and even less to the last 100 years ish. And super almost nothing to the last decade or more.
Right.
Which I'm fine with. And she uncovers a lot that I didn't know, or we don't pay attention to in general. But I think she also told it as a story from the upper classes down rather than the lower classes up, in a kind of Howard Zinn-esque sort of way, which would have been, I would have appreciated more balance in the other direction. But having that actual history is very difficult to do. I follow a couple of historians who are looking at kind of the erasure of African American history and what evidence we have of how slaves lived, who they were, who their friends were, what happened, both we can look at it easily from the grand scale, but looking at it from the individual back up, it was incredibly hard because there's just little evidence left of who they were, how they lived, what their lives were like beyond a rough sketch outline. We can say way more about George Washington's youth than we can say about, the kid who lived in,
right,
Savannah, Georgia,
yeah,
2 blocks from the docks.
yeah.
And
so we've got to, so we've got, so in the distant past, we've got to rely on things like, how representative was Frederick Douglass?
Yeah.
That's okay.
And was he the statistical anomaly who, and we know the pulling yourself up by the bootstraps story is generally a false one. So what happened in his case that allowed him to, from a statistical mechanics perspective, kind of escape from the things that were pressing him down otherwise?
Yeah.
That's a hard thing for her to pull off in a book like this.
Right.
So for me, this is a good start on the topic, but we're going to need 3 more books of this kind of depth and scope over the next 2 decades to help stem the tide of kind of where she's going.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Well, and it also sort of begs the question, do we care about, as a culture or as a reading public, do we, Frederick Douglass's experience probably isn't, representative, but he is, I mean, he did, sort of narrate his passages on, living with the slave breaker and stuff like that are really I think do kind of open a window and are powerful, and even in sort of just illustrating the ways that because he describes himself as having really been broken by that experience, and so I think there's probably there's probably some truth there, but I guess the big question seems always to be sort of, do we, for if someone didn't make it, do we care? If someone actually is just, starts as a regular person, remains as a regular person, that guy in that photo on the porch with Lyndon Johnson, just goes back to his life and becomes, nothing more than what he was before Johnson showed up. Is there is that a story that should be told? And I think that there has been a lot of, sort of gesturing towards the, sort of the dignity and the importance of sort of everyday, regular people. But, we still, gravitate toward these, whenever anybody, wants to write a bestseller, like Alex Haley, who she sort of debunks here, it becomes fiction because it's not enough just to be normal, right? You have to be, descended from the prince Kunta Kinte, who has this noble blood, and just sort of, subconsciously replicate all of those kinds of tropes. I did think that it was interesting. I mean, she does. I agree with you, Chris. She does sort of accelerate through these things, and which suggests to me that she had much more. She had done much more research on the earlier period in the book. But it's interesting. It was interesting to me that we get to this fictionalization place, right? And she puts Alex Haley alongside James Michener, who I remember my mom reading. My mom read all of Michener's books, and also other people who were sort of Michener adjacent, like James Clavell, who wrote, who sort of gave the world or the American reading public some type of a view of what Japan was like in the transition to what's his name, Tokugawa Ieyasu, um, who he called Toranaga, or Hong Kong, at the earliest sort of moments of its existence, which was very had historical elements in it, but it's weird. I mean, and now I've been sort of binging. Last night I kind of semi-binged some episodes of Black Sails, right, which just hit Netflix. And it's some sort of it's unrepentant, right? It's got like, some actual historical characters and some characters from Treasure Island, so it's just a mashup. But along the way, they do say things like, "Oh, King James has fled to France," right? So obviously, this is so now we've got a pin we can put in. We can say, okay, 1689. We know when this is happening, and that was interesting to me because that was something that I hadn't sort of picked up on the first time I watched that, whenever that was. Go ahead, Tim.
Well, you mentioned James Clavell and his Asian saga.
Mhm.
Book one, in publishing terms, was King Rat. So it's World War II POW.
Right.
And that doesn't really follow with the rest of the series in many respects.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go for the four big Far Eastern books, Shogun, Gaijin, Taipan, and I forgot what the fourth one
Noble
is.
House.
As in Japan, Hong Kong, Japan, Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And the last Hong Kong, you're up to, I think, like the 60s or something. From
Yeah, he's driving an
1600.
E-type around the island.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Taipan's, and it's the Hong Kong that I can recognise from when I was working on the mass transit railway in the late 70s.
Right, and then he extends the story to Iran in a later book, right?
Yeah, the one that went after that was Whirlwind, and that caught the back end of the Iranian Revolution, which was also when I was there doing a bit of work. But that's but honestly, I wasn't anything to do with the revolution.
Okay, we believe
one of the things I thought of. There are two groups of other historical batches of books, both by English authors. One is literally, because we mentioned 1689 a moment ago, or whatever it was, for James disappearing to France. There's another author who's is known by two initials and Sampson. I forget what the initials are, but his illustrating character is a up and coming barrister that, because obviously at that point there's no true police force, gets used by the back end of Henry VIII and the front end of Elizabeth I as a bit like a PI. So somebody goes, get me to the bottom of that problem. Who did what, when, why, and we'll chop their heads off, sort of thing. And they're actually quite good, and I've found them with all the peripheral types of discussion that go on, with the back and forth of the court politics and what's actually going on outside. The way they're merged into the story has filled in a gap because, as I said before, I stopped doing school history sometime in and around Henry IV sort of thing. And the other one is Philip Kerr, died not so long ago, and he's done 2 or 3 series, but the big one is a German policeman called Bernhard Gunther, and his 15 books cover the end of the Weimar Republic to like mid-50s, early 60s, of somebody who gets dragged in and out of the Weimar Republic politics into the Nazi period, tries to escape the Nazi control, but still ends up by working for Heydrich and Goebbels direct. And in the process of that, getting caught by the Russians into a prison camp for a while. So he ends up by working for the NKVD, the CIA, MI6, and the French Secret Service, whatever that was called back then. And all of it around, in most instances, around some form of straightforward crime that you then don't want politically too much digging around, including Heydrich's assassination, for instance, which is the one I've just finished. But in terms of a book choice, it suddenly dawned on me that at least 2 of the books we've read, if not 3, have all pushed back against elements of what, from a European point of view, we call about, and you guys call it the same, except I think you translate it into Chicago economics, as in the Austrian School of Economics. And we've had a couple of instances, particularly where we've spoken about Hayek and his book, his original big book, that then came out in the Reader's Digest version,
Right.
minus 30% of all the good things
Of all the
in Adam
nuance.
Smith
Yeah.
that didn't. And it sort of, as much as we've now believed these other authors, and we may well know because many other people have also said, and that we may have come across already, whether or not it's actually worth us reading something that's a bit older, by Hayek's book, to see what we actually think of the original. Such that, or is there a newer Austrian economics stroke Chicago School book that would be more instructive on the why and wherefore of the right's corruption? Otherwise, we end up by saying, let's read the bell curve, because that's anti-Darwin, in effect, which seems to be an extreme too far, given what we know about it generally. So it was a wonder of whether Hayek was worth a dip for a book, as opposed to, is there somebody else that might be illustrative to us generally, both European and American point of view, that is on the libertarian side, as opposed to the far right ends up by being a Nazi stroke fascist, whichever phrase you want to call it, versus Ku Klux Klan. Because on it, at A level, I don't see any KKK being libertarian, pure and simple. Individually, some of them might be, but they've got things on top that are very racial. How is the anarchist element of libertarian, stroke Austrian even, worthwhile pursuing and understanding? And obviously at the moment, there isn't a second book that I know about that is genuine enough, say, on what do we need to do to the current capitalist system to move it off. We've done Raworth. That's purely down to the idea of donut stroke circular. Or we end up with a slightly more socialist view, anti-libertarian approach, maybe, that is Jason Hayek, not Hayek, Hinkle.
Yeah.
And there's a Japanese guy who's recently published a book whose name escapes me at the moment, Keisho Satoyo. He's an out-and-out Marxist, but he's given what's being given some good reviews of this is what needs to happen and change type approach to be a mitigation element economically on societal and climate and biodiversity collapse. So it was just a case of I don't recall hearing anybody talk about Hayek recently. So it was thought, fry it in the pot, see what people might throw back. I'll duck if it's cabbages and tomatoes, but if it's something sensible, I'll try and catch.
I am not for it's funny too, because I'm not. I think that's an interesting question. I'm not really that familiar with things that have been written in the last, I would say, I don't know, 10 or 15 years or even maybe even 20 years. I mean, it seemed to me like when I was last looking at it, the things that were being written, to sort of carry on that, it seemed to me that nobody had really kind of picked up the Austrian mantle and kind of was running it forward. There were organizations, like the Foundation for Economic Education, in Irvington, New York at the time. I don't know where it is now. They, who have sort of, I think, morphed into sort of cultural critics. I mean, I see they're doing YouTube videos now about, movie reviews. But there were people, I mean, like Israel Kirzner was an economist who was sort of a next generation, and he wrote a lot about, competition and entrepreneurship and capitalism, and he wrote specifically about people like Ludwig von Mises and and Eugen von Bauer, or however you want to pronounce his name. And those people who were around Hayek and were maybe a little bit more central to the actual Austrianness of the Austrians. But yeah, I mean, and then there were other, kind of weirdos like what was his name? Leonard Peikoff, right? Who was sort of an heir apparent of Ayn Rand for a while before she died, after she threw over the Brandons. Who wrote something called, I think, The Ominous Parallels, which, in the, I don't know, that might go as far back as the 80s, that talked about how America was becoming Weimar Germany, which, it had some interesting comparisons and stuff. I've really tried to avoid, I really can't stand Milton Friedman. So I've really, kind of tried to avoid the continuation of sort of neoclassical thinking into the Chicago school. Just because I was interested in Chile, and I think that they, that whole American response to Latin America, was interesting too, right? I mean, the idea that, well, we'll apply all of these free market Chicago school planning regimes under a dictatorship in Chile. And the flip side of that is, on the other side of the Southern Cone, we don't know what the hell to think of Argentina, right? How the relationship, in the second half of the 20th century after the Second World War you know, between Argentina, pursuing, things like import and, import um, replacement industrialism, to reduce, specifically to talk about dependence, right? And coming up with that whole economic argument, which is, in a sense, kind of it's not that far from libertarianism, but it has kind of a nationalist, flavor to it from the perspective of having been a nation that was under the thumb of these policies, right? This sort of globalization that served the financial centers, right? So yeah, so I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, to go back to white trash, there are a lot of things in there that she skates right by, and maybe that has to do with sort of accelerating into the ending of the book, and dealing with stuff that she didn't really want to deal with just so she could bring it up close to the present. But she talks about the Iranian Revolution as if the Iranian Revolution in 79 was just this weird anomaly that happened out of the blue and had to do with, religious fundamentalism, and not with 1954. And she says, ousting the Shah. I mean, that was all she said about the Shah, was that he got, ousted. So yeah, I mean, it's weird to me that there's, yeah, I don't know what, I mean, I could look into that. I mean, I am sort of always a little bit interested in kind of where this economic thinking is going, but I don't have something at my fingertips to say, yeah, this would be the thing to pursue. I mean, the one thing that I do think is really interesting is sort of the way that that this in economics, that theory gets so embedded, right? I mean, we talked about, maybe going, Chris, you mentioned maybe, looking at a sociologist to understand, the last 10 years because they're more willing to talk about it. Um, you know, yeah, but at the same time, they're willing to bandy about, these, structural theories, right? And fits, anthropologists as well. I mean, there's always been my beef with anthropology, right? Is that theory is first, and and observation and contingency is sort of well down the list, um, which strikes me as sort of ahistorical. So another thing that we, I mean, from a Marxist perspective, um, and weirdly, Marxism, is still alive. I find, especially when I'm talking to literature people. And I decided to get into this either certificate or master's program in English literature, um, to use my free tuition that I can get, while I'm still, in the Minnesota state system. And I talked for, I don't know, about an hour with my new advisor, and he really really wanted to talk um, about all of this sort of new Marxist decolonial theoretic identity stuff, which was weird to me, because he was much more, kind of much more up to date on stuff that has been said recently, and he's calling out, verso books that have just come out. So that was kind of interesting. I thought, well, okay, maybe I need to, especially if I'm going to have conversations with people, um, in those fields, and grad students in those fields, maybe I've got to, sort of bone up on this a little bit. Yeah, Piketty, I think, wanted to kind of get close to it without really. Do you think he really engaged it? I mean, it's been months since a couple of years since we really focused on that, but.
Well, I think he got it from and this is for context for those watching and not looking at the chat. Um, Pat was asking about, can we look at the original land grants and how those families and people benefited now? Where are they now? Where are their ancestors now?
Mhm.
And the opposite of that question is, can you look at where the ancestors of the slaves are at now and how they didn't benefit,
Mhm.
obviously within American culture? But Piketty, I think, looked more at, and I think some of his stuff was in the British context of when slavery ended and the government gave massive payouts to slave owners because, hey, you lost your slaves and, that massive wealth that you had now isn't there. So we're going to replace it with actual cash.
Mhm.
And for some reason, I want to say it was Ed Miliband. I'd have to check my notes, but he specifically pointed out two or three particular names who are at the upper elite crust of British wealth and power, who all owed their family money to either the slave trade and or those massive payouts that the British government gave at the time.
Right.
Um,
Right. And then he continued into the French context with sort of the massive reparations that Haiti had to pay
yeah.
to
Yeah.
the French Empire. Yeah, that
And
whole
are still paying. They're still
yeah,
paying.
it's absurdly. Yeah, the persistence, and I think that actually, to her credit, I think that, Eisenberg does, kind of mention this in her, kind of in her epilogue, right? That this idea of, persistence of wealth and land, and this sort of baked in inequity that we had tried to sort of paper over by saying, and I think, I didn't do an actual search, but I don't think she ever mentioned Frederick Jackson Turner. But obviously, for me, there's echoes of this idea, of the Turner, thesis that, that the frontier, sort of is the thing that makes America's American, right? And and that it's this leveler, and that, I mean, she mentions Teddy Roosevelt and other people like that, and Richard Hakluyt she keeps going back to, although which one she doesn't specify. Uh, but uh, but this idea that that the land was somehow leveling. She sort of debunks that. And I wish she would have spent more time on that, because I think that's really interesting, right? This, kind of digging into the, and getting the receipts of how, it was not, I think I don't know, she does enough, I guess, with, talking about speculators. I mean, there are speculators throughout the whole, throughout that whole period. I think she mentions,
She
maybe
does
she
kind of
doesn't.
she she does review, I think it was in the epilogue, certainly in one of the last two chapters, the kind of throwing at the poor people to the frontier, either to deal with the Indians or to kind
Mhm.
of improve the land initially. And then once they've come in, the rich and the powerful move in and then take over kind of the good bits
Yeah.
for themselves, and then push the poorer people either back out or away into kind of the spaces where they, belong
Right.
from a breeding perspective,
Yeah.
you know. But I don't know that she made. So it would be interesting to have a handful of specific examples along the way. One of my favorite examples that she uses the kid from Deliverance
Hmm.
when he was like
He's
12, and
working at
then
Walmart. Yeah.
here's where he is working at Walmart. I really wish there were more like concrete examples like that
Yeah.
to like underline her message along the way. And I literally, it's like in the last two paragraphs that kind of pops up
Yeah.
almost.
Yeah. I thought that was effective. It was kind of brief and almost throwaway. Um,
Or if you're going to use it as you having that in the opening in the introduction as the, hey, here's where we're going,
right. Frame the whole
rather than
chapter
leaving
around.
it for the last fact in the last paragraph.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of weird because she mentions, I mean, she dips into, um, like she mentions Nathaniel Gorham. She calls him a Federalist from, I'm dipping back. I just checked in the index, and he's way back on page 107. Right. She talks about him during this whole Shays Rebellion discussion about, she calls him a Federalist from Massachusetts, who was writing to James Madison about his state's ratifying convention in 1788, and was talking about squatters and crackers and things like that. Who live upon other people's land. Well, he was not only a Federalist from Massachusetts, but he was one of the recipients of, 1 million acres in Western New York of the, what was called the Phelps and Gorham Purchase. That they, so they were, Phelps and Gorham were land speculators who basically got this huge land grant and then sold it had it surveyed and sold it in parcels in, kind of Western New York between kind of the middle of the state and Genesee County. So, Finger Lakes region. And, and so they, so there's, so that kind of thing is sort of embedded in the story. And I think that she, maybe part of the issue is that she's so knowledgeable about that. So, I mean, that's really her period, that, maybe she assumes that people know, who Nathaniel Gorham is, and doesn't elaborate, and I think that's a good lesson for, for me, and people who want to, continue talking about this stuff, to, to actually sort of drill down into these stories and tell these stories, sort of more fully, especially about this idea of, I mean, there's a whole story about Pennsylvania too, right? About, so what is Pennsylvania? Is it, sort of this, Quaker promised land of, or is it, it's weird, right? It's owned by the Penn family, the whole thing, the whole place, and then it becomes this other thing, and how does that happen? And does it really happen, or is it just myth making? I think that would have been really kind of interesting to dig into. And additionally, honestly, where are they now? Right? Where are the Youngs and the Penns and and these first families of Pennsylvania? Because I think that's
and are they good at holding on to that wealth over time? Because even traditionally in America, if you have a family business that succeeds and does well in the first or second generations, by the third or fourth generations, the children have lost the family business because they're either not talented enough or as talented or couldn't hold on to it, or the business died or something happened. And that generally has been the story on the business front. But does that necessarily mean that the kids aren't doing something else that keeps them with the family wealth that came from that company?
And that's the big question, isn't it, Chris? I think that is, that we have that sort of rags to riches to rags, kind of arc, is an archetype, but I think it might be a myth, or alternatively, I think it might apply at a particular level of wealth and not necessarily uniformly through it, because and that's where actually that Nelson Aldrich book that I was reading, Old Money, was really interesting to me, because because there was a suggestion that there was some type of persistence, right? And I've mentioned that other book, The Sun Also Rises, several times in the past. It kind of talks about that sort of persistence of elite status, and what are the mechanisms of that? How does that happen? At what levels, does it happen, and where does it not? Sorry, go ahead, Tim.
But it's the the fourth generation type issue.
Mm-hmm.
The mum and pop store a la the Waltons with whatever his name was in town,
Ike,
is fine until Walmart turns up.
Yeah.
Okay? So it's I want to run a bookshop, inverted commas. I'm fine in my town. I need a mechanism to reach the surrounding villages. But then when Amazon in the next city puts up a distribution center, my customers go in the main, and the record store around the corner goes bust too, because that's where all the records come from as well. They're doing CDs all now with streaming.
Mm-hmm. And the Blockbuster Video.
One of the things that seems to come through for the small business is that they want to do X, and they never sit back and say, what happens when X doesn't be needed? Now, it's the other one that comes up a lot is the guy that does the horse whips for the buggies when we're all driving horse-drawn buggies.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the few 500,000 people doing that job now? They're not. They're doing something else. And because the family business is the family business, it seems to be a much more difficult thing to transition to be a corporate, to be a corporation, and do something else. So if you look at the history of some of the corporations, not all, but some of them, and it's like the one I think that's probably the most easy to transition and look at is Warren Buffett and whatever that one's called. I've forgotten now.
Berkshire Hathaway.
What did it start off as when he got shafted by them? So he bought them out. But their original product, their original market and all the rest of it is not what he does now. He's 20% airlines and his 40% insurance business and whatever. The company doesn't do what mum and pop started the company was doing, and not even the third or maybe fourth generation of that family were doing, if they transitioned to something slightly a bit more next to, and it's a bit like the argument over farming.
Glad you went there.
There's
That
an
was where I
element
wanted
of
to go.
where farming wants to try and even out the boom bust, not so much in the money, but in terms of the crops. But a particular place gets such a reputation, like Idaho for potatoes or whatever, that somebody that then goes and says, "Oh, I'm gonna grow something else," and everybody poo-poos it, and it'll do well 1 year because it's different.
Mhm.
But then it's a case of the surrounding infrastructure that supports all the small farmers that corrupts the process isn't in place for that one odd one. I've suddenly grown on whatever it is, orange trees. Not
Right.
that you probably would do, but I'm just saying. There's no infrastructure to make orange juice or take orange to make marmalade in Idaho. So there's a load of extra expenses. So it doesn't make any money. So
Well,
where
and
is the flex? Where is the ability to lose the roots and move both in theme terms and location, and literally decide we don't make horse buggy whips anymore. We make tires.
well, and also where's the ability to understand, industry change, right? When agriculture, like the chicken farmers of America.
The first,
right?
Careful, chicken farmers to me means, a guy called Himmler, because that's what he did before he became political.
Okay. I'm still going to talk about chicken farmers.
No, I'll come at chicken farming.
So the first generation have the insight, the enterprise, the forward looking to do something that in theory has got a market and there's not that much competition immediately, so they make a success of it. By the time you get to the fourth generation, fifth generation even, it's gone. But one of the few families that still exist in that context is banking. Because banking is always going to be needed in the current context.
Mm-hmm.
So family banks, they get eaten by bigger banks. I mean, my current UK retail bank, I've been with since I started work, but I'm actually on my fourth brand because they've got eaten and eaten and eaten and eaten.
Well, it's not the business level. It's what's happening at the family wealth level. If you had a massive bank, even if you got eaten up, what happens to the children and the children's children? Were they eaten up in such a way that the family managed to maintain enough money over multiple generations to not have to care?
Right. And I think that's an issue, right? Because a lot of them become that trust fund generation after generation. If they achieve, a certain level of, FU money, right?
It's like you can look at Trump. So Trump Sr., Frank, made billions in real estate, which his son broadly pissed away.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have that full story yet, but broadly, I think there's enough reporting to say he has demolished a multi-billion-dollar empire.
Mm-hmm.
And the third generation of kids now are trying to do something, but they're relying wholly on family money and what they may receive from dad. But their kids and their kids' kids 2 generations out.
Or Jared funnels in that Saudi money. Who knows?
Yeah, are gonna have, they're not gonna, how are they gonna hold on to and maintain that money?
Yeah.
And that's the bigger issue. It's not even the smaller scope, but what happens at the bigger scope and goes, or what happens to Shannon Zuckerberg's kids? Can they hold on to that?
Right.
Or when he dies, does it all collapse?
Right.
And they're left with a sum of money, but do they have enough class and status and clout to hold on to it for 3 more generations?
Right. Well, and I think part of that has to do with, kind of creating institutional structures, creating, foundations and things like that. But I also want to come back. I want to go back to that issue that I think she doesn't deal with as well about, sort of whole industry changes that kind of get sort of swept under the rug, right? In this idea of, of what's going on with these rural people. We used to have, and I will go to the poultry industry, right? We used to have family farms that ran poultry operations. We don't really have that anymore. Nominally, these are still oftentimes called family farms. What they basically are is they're sort of feudal fiefdoms now, where Tyson controls all of the inputs and is the only market for all of the outputs, right? And so, where you've got, people who might, a generation earlier have been, fairly self-sufficient, family operators of, of a poultry operation, even if it was a million, a million broiler kind of operation, they would have been self-sufficient. And they would have actually been sort of running their own business. Now they've basically been captured by this industry. So this kind of consolidation of especially rural industries. So it's not only the fact that, that the Main Street, Woolworths gets hollowed out, by Walmart, but that, there isn't we don't have. It's kind of weird. We have this sort of romantic vision of, of American farms, with a cow and chickens and, and a horse and, and all these things, and fields of corn or whatever. And that is so rare nowadays. That almost doesn't exist because people have been sort of required by the industrialization of agriculture to specialize. And that creates a whole other sort of a class thing. I mean, these are basically rural industrial workers, right? And so there's even more of a connection between the poor in cities and the poor in the countryside that she doesn't really address in here.
If you farm in farming wise, you specialize, and if you specialize, you get caught up in a certain infrastructure which grows, and that then forces other locals to you to follow your specialization because the structure's there for them to use. Whereas there's a guy called Mark Shepard, he's up in Minnesota somewhere, so he's not far from you, that's pushing against single crop type farm groups almost, and saying, let the farmers run the infrastructure again, push farms down in scale, but if you do it in a regen version, you have some vegetable row crops, you have some fruit crops, you have some meat crops, and you maybe your final crop that you pass on might well be the timber crop. Because you now make different sections of land on your one piece be different crops, so they all have different timelines, cropping costs, growth patterns, and as your perennial crops, including bush fruit and trees and stuff, grow bigger, you lose your arable space to the next guy. But the co-op, the local co-op, holds, amongst other things, it's a bit like a tool library. Yeah. They hold all the stuff that you might only need for 4 or 5 years, but then goes to the next guy in effect.
Yeah. Well, and it's very
and all the
permacultural
and all
in
the
that
local
sense.
and
Yeah.
all the first step processing
Yeah.
gets done locally, so there's employment locally that's not stuck in a field, because many people don't want to do that. But it gives you employment locally at a sensible scale without having a 20,000 people Ford factory turn up.
Yes.
Then,
yeah. And Mark
you know,
Mark mentioned that
acts as a piece of
in the
gravity
chat,
that
right?
pushes
There are
everybody else.
CFAs around the Twin Cities, right? I have in the when I was living down there, I subscribed to them. Actually, there's one up here in Bemidji too that although I am going to have a garden, we also actually my daughter bought us a CFA share for this summer as a holiday present. She's a kind of a greenie out in New Hampshire. So that was a nice gift. So yeah, there are people, and actually the CFA up here is also the place that does on the weekends does Zen meditation groups. So they're kind of interesting people. But yeah, there is that, and there is a sense of of escaping this this corporatization, the agribusiness model. And the only thing that I will say, as it's not even a criticism, but it is a potential difficulty with that, is that generally those foods that you get at the co-op come at a premium because they're organic or they're locally sourced, right? It's not a solution for oftentimes for working class people, right? Because they can't afford to buy the organic locally grown beets that are $6 a pound when you could get them at Costco, right? For a buck, and so and especially if they're in a can, right? Which is less, much less healthy.
But the other thing is the diversity that you mentioned. A Zen retreat gives maybe employment to one other person. That's not scale. There's the issue of getting enough people back into the countryside to do countryside work, but also lots of small scale industrial retail whatever, such that you don't end up with cities being 95% of the population.
Right. Well, one of the interesting things that Joel Salatin
that takes away a lot of the mismatch in the organic versus the non-organic, i.e. the industrial versus the organic food production, which you go somewhere like Senegal, there's no distinction because there isn't necessarily the money for the pesticides or the money for bagged fertilizer, but the regenerative type ideas means the farmer has, oh, look, I don't need 4 cash crops. I've got 25 other normal crops that feed me and the village and the town.
Right.
Let's build on that.
I'm not disagreeing with you, Tim. I'm just saying that I mean we haven't really, I mean, as a society, we haven't explored even the fact that I mean, there are people who are doing it, right? Like Vandana Shiva is criticizing the Green Revolution in India, and saying it was all a sham and it was really all about just mining groundwater. But but that's a message that is only now sort of getting articulated and argued. And Joel Salatin, the guy who I mean, Joel Salatin's an interesting character to me, right? Because he's on the one hand, he's a libertarian. On the other, he is, sort of, I think, the inheritor of a vast tract of expensive Virginia farmland in the Shenandoah Valley, that, to his credit, he has turned to, new and renewable uses. But one of the most interesting things that I thought he said in some of his more recent books was, that a lot of this stuff you could do on leased land, right? So he was developing, these things that you could, these structures that you could tow behind a tractor, from section to section of the field, and use low voltage electrical mesh fences, which I actually have a bunch of in my backyard right now to keep the dog from running up the street. But these were things that people who did not have the access to land purchase could actually start to do, and could start to kind of change the system. And yeah, so I think it's going to take some creative thinking.
Money speaks big in terms of being able to own land, which brings me back to that little quote from, there was a far too nice little interview with Bill Gates. One of the things everybody's up in arms about is now the biggest, or almost the biggest, farmland owner.
Yeah.
And then and going back to some of the other point where we've spoke about just how much money is in the top 20 people type thing. Mm-hmm. It turns out it's less than 1% of his assets. Mm-hmm. And it is I'm not quite sure whether it was then also qualified by the non-farming people, or it was down as an individual, because we all see Bill as an individual, as opposed to Bill's money is not Bill's, it's in the foundation and it's in his company to be tax efficient, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. And almost every group that you touch on that wants to say partly my food bill and partly I don't want to do my office job anymore, the biggest single hurdle, the biggest barrier, is access to land. Mm-hmm. You've got one extreme, you've got people that do pirate gardening or guerrilla gardening, and they have no idea whether that plant will be there at crop point, versus what do you do to get some land? Do you then make a little community of 10 people such that you farm it as 10 plus people or 5 families or whatever? At which point you've still got, how do we get from nothing as year zero into a stable position that we've now got? Oh, we're starting to take timber out as well as fruit, as well as meat, as et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And none of those people seem to come over saying the likes of, my output market of preference is the likes of Costco. Because the other thing that comes through is the retailers have managed to put their weight so hard that the amount of money, when you look at the pie chart for, I spend $10 on a pound of apples or whatever. Uh-huh. Where does that $10 go? Who gets it? And invariably, the biggest slice goes to the retailer, who may or may not be also the person that collects them and stores them. In some instances, obviously, our UK-wise, our big 6 grocers do a lot of that, and they also own farms. They just don't do the farming. Mm-hmm. So there's already a lease aspect there.
Yep.
But you're coming over as a tenant farmer that does as he's told. He doesn't farm the land. He does what he's told. And that's an element that has to break. And Joe is one person, but there's a good dozen or others who seem to have managed to skirt round those problems and have got a small, most of them are 10 acres or less, doing farmers market type vegetables as their primary source of income. Mm-hmm. And then you get a few like Richard Perkins, whose half his income comes from the books and from the courses he runs.
Right.
And so that's the alternative. But to do those courses, some of which are offline and in in person, he ends up by employing 10 people because he needs them to put the tents up, do the cooking, and do the clear up, amongst other things.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
So-
and there's an element of kind of hustle culture there too, right? That is, especially when you connect that to some type of outward facing, media, teaching either online or offline. One of the things that strikes me, about this is that it does seem like a lot of the avenues for, for actually getting some value out of doing these things have been, have been blocked by, in a lot of cases, I mean, historically, in a lot of cases, by sort of well-meaning legislation, right? I mean, in America, right, you can't really sell, you can't sell meat very easily, right? You've got, since 1906, since the Meat Inspection Act and then the Pure Food and Drug Act that followed, the jungle and the exposés of, of the Chicago yards.
So in this
you've got
case,
these regulations that prevent this, so when I get, I do buy, half a cow annually from a local farmer whose wife, works in the hospital with my wife. And of course you have to have $1,500 available to buy half a cow. So that's a barrier to entry, right? But
a big enough freezer
every single package, every single white paper wrapped package is stamped not for resale, right? Because it's not, because the locker that actually processes this meat can't get a USDA inspector.
But you also look at, say, I can't remember, it's another Joel, I think. Joel Bacon did the corporation documentary and book that goes with it, was talking also about the way the bigger corporations manage to control the market and exclude certain products. The extreme I saw happen here. There was somebody here that had designed a gas burner that was much more like an aircraft jet engine. So you got a much more heat output, usable, even though the gas is the same. And he got bought out. And he got bought out with a huge type of NDA kind of exclusion of you can't come back in the industry. And he got bought out by a bunch of Kuwaitis because they wanted to protect their gas oil fields. So he got literally like 3 years pension contributions that will now last him for the rest of his life and probably half of his family to stop the final bits of development. And he was getting like 90+%, and he was trying to get 95 sort of thing, of ability to convert the base calorific value of the gas into usable heat. And it's like, well, the gas providers don't want you to do that because it means they'll sell less gas.
Yeah.
And it's the same sort of conversation I was having at some point, whereby I was knocking the utility bill down for the development that I was on. And the utilities kept on coming along and saying, why are you not using so much this year as you did last year? You're getting bigger, aren't you? Well, yeah, the business went up 25%. Your unit price went up 25%, but I still saved $10 million. Tough luck. Well, we're going to have to look at your standing charges then. And it's like, yeah, but I've got a 55-year contract.
Yeah. Well, it's like there's a famous story, isn't there, about a young kid who developed basically the technology and patented the technology that became really sort of the basis of regenerative braking in hybrid and electric cars. And some auto, I don't know the details of the story, but apparently, as I vaguely remember it, some auto company bought the patent from him and then basically stuck it in the drawer.
Catch and kill.
I mean, the reverse of that, if you go through, and I'm sure we've picked it up from somewhere, and there's a good, nice long conspiracy theory too on it. Is light bulbs. You go back to when Swan and Edison were head to head trying to make a light bulb last more than 100 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And then they were getting it up to like, oh, we're almost at 10,000. That's good, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And all the light bulb companies got together and said, no, let's settle on a nice, 2,500 hours.
Right.
Such that if you produced a light bulb in another country that would do more than 2,500, the cartel would turn up and undersell you until you went bust, and then reimpose the 2,500 hours.
Yep. Didn't Philips finally break that model? Didn't they kind of disrupt that ultimately?
The LEDs finally broke it, amongst other things.
Well,
right? But when everybody, the only real normal domestic commercial lamp was a normal tungsten lamp. It was let's do, and of all places, apparently the cartel was based in Geneva, Switzerland, just to be outside the reach
surprise.
of most other people.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
One of the things that she does, I think, a good job of doing is kind of making the point that you've got all this new land in America, and we're going to send all the poor people over to work it, and that's going to be. And at that time, tenant farming was the majority of the population of the planet. You were subsistence farmers.
Mm-hmm.
And that begins to shift in the early 1900s. And people move to cities, or the Industrial Revolution is taken over. And that's where the poor people work, is in factories. And she doesn't really touch on that massive shift in the early 1900s, and even less so now, when that manufacturing shift has gone overseas and that manufacturing has disappeared, and we have a kind of a new class of poor. So the first thing, you're supposed to work and improve the land, and that's what the poor do.
Mm-hmm.
Then in the 1900s, the poor work in the factory, and that's what they're supposed to do. And the big issue I see now is, what are the poor supposed to do for the next 100 years?
Right.
We have no idea.
Right.
Or it seems to be emerging that it's, you need to go into a service business,
Mm-hmm.
and you need to be a barber, or work on people's teeth, or work in a shop somewhere and sell things.
Right.
But that's not. But I think and we would be horribly remiss this week reading this book not to mention the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States is looking at homelessness and camping, and whether you as a human being can camp legally on public, private, or other land in the United States, and what that looks like.
Mm.
And that's, a huge, it's not settled, but I can guess where it may be going, in what direction, based on our prior history of this subject. I'll put in a little context if you haven't heard it pop up this week, because the Supreme Court's been doing other highline things this week that, are getting more attention, I think.
Yeah.
We're looking at how it affects one of the, most famous men in America, and what the outcome of that is. And almost no one is looking at what's going to happen with the outcome of the poorest people amongst us, and where they can or can't choose to live.
It's almost like they're trying to distract us.
Yeah, it's like, oh, look over here. It's the same story as Lipsky made in The Parrot and the Igloo. It's the issue is here, and we're talking about it, but world wars pop up, or other crises intervene, so we don't pay attention. We take our eyes off the ball and look at something else, instead of dealing with, it's almost like a government, and the way American popular culture is set up is a reverse Pareto principle. Instead of focusing on the 20% that will make the difference for the 80%, We focus on the least important things the most,
Mhm.
and ignore the things that could really make the bigger difference at the end of the day.
Yeah, 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 and how to shift the conversation back to those issues.
Or as Tim was kind of talking, I almost was thinking it, and it's a weird thing, and it's probably very politically charged to use the phrase, but it's all central planning. The real question is, who's doing the central planning? Is
Mhm.
it the people? Is it the government? Or is it corporations? I think are like the three big groups.
And does it matter
You know,
who's which of those groups ultimately is doing it? Because I mean, aside from the people, if the people actually were doing it, but a group in society called the people, called democracy, is not the same as real, kind of participation.
yeah.
But
Well, I mean, if you look at it, America really is an oligopoly, more so than even a republic or a. It's all the rich people we're sending. We're not sending average Joe to Congress. Even J.D. Vance, who writes Hillbilly Elegy and talks about
yeah,
his people, is the smartest and best and brightest of the group, who went to Yale and had a leg up more than any of his brothers, sisters, or cousins, any of them
yep,
that he's talking about in his book.
yep,
He's the one, and now he's the one who's representing and sitting in power, but he's more concerned, I guarantee you, with maintaining and creating wealth and power for himself than he is any of his friends and cousins
yeah,
or people back home.
right.
He says he's ostensibly representing them, but is he really?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and yeah, and again, it's so, I mean, and that's sort of what struck me about the Fareed Zakaria thing too, right? It's so easy to sort of, if you've got this universe of points, it's almost, I mean, it's almost like the obsidian vault, thing. You can connect any number of them, right? And Vance can connect, these dots and these sort of descriptive moments and these notes about his people that he purports to represent or he's speaking for, and use them to advance almost any argument, um, by sort of creatively
The
mashing that
a
on.
bit like I said 3 books ago, I think it was, when um, Anna was still around, and I said to the group, okay, we've looked at these 2 or 3 books almost back to back that are very environmentally conscious, climate change, biodiversity change, but those changes can't be managed or mitigated without a change in the way that the politics is being used. As
What are
in,
we going to do about it?
with part of what we're saying, every politician that's been mentioned in this book, on one side of the aisle, has always been treating them as others.
Mhm.
You're always kicking down, you're never helping, etc., etc. And oddly enough, you still expect them to vote for you anyway.
Yeah.
And and as with Justin King, the Bow of the Fifth Column, he's always picking up. He's just surprised just how much the people do not vote in their own best interest repeatedly. And my point when I asked the question of everybody else was, what are you doing to lower your carbon footprint type thing? What are you doing to regenerate your back garden with a few natives? Because it doesn't take a lot to get the birds and the bees back again. it doesn't have to be, oh, it's a wild prairie. You
Mhm.
still have a garden,
Yeah.
as illustrated by Jennifer Owen's stuff in Leicester in the UK.
Mhm.
And she wrote 2 hardback books that did a detailed survey of what came to her garden over 30 years,
Mhm.
including finding new species and species that were thought to be extinct.
Yeah.
Because nobody was looking close enough.
Mhm.
And as soon as you start to look, you start to find. And it's a bit like the microplastic problem. As I've mentioned a couple of times, I think back about 2010 and before, there's a whole series of whale beachings, baleen whale beachings and dolphin type beaked tooth whales. And everybody's looking for the complex solution, as in, oh, it's all the military submarines putting all the acoustics around. Oh, it's the XYZ food side, or it's, pollution from chemical plants.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden, particularly over the last 5 years, it's, oh, this baleen whale, we think he died of the fact he's got 200 kilos of plastic bags in his stomach. Now, whoever was doing the autopsy pre-2010, are you telling me they didn't find the bags or the plastic in the stomach? No. Possibly, there isn't a tick box on the form that you fill in to say found how many kilos of plastic bags, because those processes evolve naturally but are never complete, ever.
Mhm.
They get very well worn and people don't want to change them, etc., because change is difficult.
Mhm.
So it's not even necessarily saying somebody was explicitly criminally running a conspiracy to not tell me about the plastic bags. It's just it wasn't part of the normal day-to-day vocabulary at the time.
Mhm.
And what seemed to be the change was the photographs of all the baby seabirds on the various little islands they use, particularly the albatross birds, out in the South Atlantic, where there is no natural plastic. There's no Walmart giving away plastic bags on South Georgia or whatever. In fact, there's nobody that lives there apart from a couple of platoons of Royal Marines on exercise. So, the plastic has gone worldwide and it's popping up in different places. But we don't know about it because we weren't looking. And the same as there's a group in either Plymouth or Portsmouth University in the UK that has started to, with a very fine filter, to go into people's homes and filter the air to capture the dust. And then they split the dust, as in, because most of the household dust is dead skin and hair, and to other things. What's the other things? Big proportion of it is plastic. And so they're the people that came up with the headline, or at least the journalists took their information and made the headline, is that over the month you eat about enough plastic, or you breathe in about enough plastic to make a credit card. So all of a sudden, because it's got that headline little metaphor, everybody knows about it. So they're all worried about, if mummy is breathing and eating in, what's coming out in mummy's milk to the baby? So they look at babies and lo and behold, there's plastic. I don't know how good it was because I've only seen it once and I've only seen one version of it. Somebody put a picture where they'd taken a bite out of a pear and where they'd bitten had something on the inside that was on the pear that was still left. It's a fragment of plastic. So where had that come from? How had it got in there? There was no real discussion. And yeah, Dustin Hoffman has got a lot to answer for.
Yep.
And there's a level to where how fine a question do you need to ask?
Mhm.
Find the research group or the university that's doing it, and then are you then going to, because you've asked it in a certain way and you're paying for it and all the rest of it, do you then get tagged with being nasty corporate
Mhm.
control of things like glyphosate research?
Mhm.
Because you
Well,
can see there are two sets of researchers. Some get paid by industry and some don't get paid by industry. And the industry ones have found very little problem with glyphosate, yet everybody else has found lots of problems with glyphosate.
yeah,
So what colour rose glasses have you got today?
yeah.
Type thing for looking for plastic.
Well,
etc.
I mean, and there are bigger, there are obviously, in the culture that we're living in, right? I mean, we can't even say that, that the US or its allies, did the biggest climate crime in the history of the planet, you know, a couple of years ago when they blew up a Russian pipeline. Um, so where, so what, so in
I,
what venue,
I,
at what
I,
point do
I'll
we
take
get to
that.
actually start to have these conversations?
I'll take that one and turn it round slightly and saying the liberation of Kuwait was one thing, but the fact that we didn't roll on and regime change there and then, Iraq, therefore they had the opportunity to sit, rest, and whatever it was, 5 or 6 years, whatever, sit back. And then when we did invade, they blew up all their oil wells. That's probably a bigger problem than the gas pipeline,
Oh,
long term,
okay.
right?
I'm not, I mean,
But
yeah, I
yeah,
mean, I don't know. I don't
then
have
of course
have data to argue
all
that
of
point.
all of the Paris Agreement and all of the IPCC stuff, the US particularly, has only ever given numbers excluding the military.
Mhm.
And I'm not even sure how big the military is, because at certain times, even the Coast Guard gets lumped in.
Mhm.
And of course, the way you've militarized with second-hand military equipment the police forces, some of those riot type vehicles don't do very well on their mileage,
Mhm.
for sure,
Yeah.
right? So how far has that? I don't care about the environment on a day-to-day action when the important thing is to shoot that guy or do that regime change, which may or may not be a good thing. Let's not give Saddam too much credit. Yet I know, having worked on a few military sites, the amount of paperwork in the UK they go through when they do a fire test on a military airfield, because the foam stuff is absolutely really shit toxic, right? And the bunding and the drainage changes and all that sort of, such that when we wash it off the runway, can't flush it down the drain to the river.
Mhm.
You've got to capture it. What do you do when you capture it? You send it to the local cement works, the same as you do. I mean, I think it's at Fort Meade, might be Fort Bragg, is where your biological research is. UK wise, it's a place called Porton Down. When they clean up their experiments, they send it to cement makers, because the 1200 odd degree flaming kills everything, cleans everything up in the least polluting way possible. It's just a very bad thing to have to do, but you've got to do it. It's just you can't do the same with nuclear stuff. It's different. The chemistry of the biology you could deal with in one way, but the physics you can't deal. Yeah, and I've always wondered why we just don't put it in canisters and shoot it off to the sun. But apparently, the orbital mechanics don't let you do that. You can't. We can't fire stuff out of Earth orbit and then let it drift into the sun. because the orbital mechanics don't work. Apparently, I haven't bothered to check because I haven't seen the actual full statement of how that works. But the anecdotal conversations and stuff is the orbital mechanics don't work. That's not to suggest that it would suddenly come back and start orbiting and become like a meteor to fall out of the sky around us. But it might well be that that's why we want SpaceX, instead of going to Mars outward, go back way towards Venus and then chuck it towards the sun. I don't know.
But it isn't.
At some point, there's got to be a break-even point, right?
Yeah.
But isn't there also a risk factor of your rocket doesn't make it off the pad or into the mechanics? I think that was always what I had read as the concern.
Before you even worry about that, it's the cost per pound to put anything into outer space just kills it from the start.
Well, but the future of humanity, Chris.
Nuclear waste is on the heavy side.
Then the so cheap we won't have to meter it electricity ain't so cheap, right?
No, not when you count any of the externalities. I would recommend that we
the whole
talk
cycle.
About the Graeber book at some point.
There's all that donut element. You take the whole cycle cost, but you go back to the libertarian thing, and the one thing I've been trying to dig around and not got very far with is, of course, the straightforward libertarian allows him to do anything on his land he likes. But in the process of doing what he wants to do, there's either airside or landside or waterborne pollution. But at the moment, he's still not picking the cost up of that, because I'm doing this business. It's all mine. I had no help. Yeah, but hang on a minute. There's all that help out there cleaning the fucking rubbish up. Or
not to mention the road to get to your lot, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that one of the reasons so in the chat we're talking about maybe making the Democracy Project the book after this next book, and I would go for that because I think that one of the interesting things about it to me was that it sort of dealt with this question of should we run these. I mean, and it kind of goes to what you've been saying, Tim. Like, okay, so what are we going to do about it? Thing, it deals with it in that way of not only what it was that was their cause, right, in Zuccotti Park and the Occupy movement, but also the ways that they decided to try to relate to each other and to organize a movement. What just happened?
Oh no, I it's that one of the hand signals they use, like, oh yeah, that's a good idea.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right.
Or
and that whole, I mean, and I love there's a moment in there when he actually describes the way that they repeat things, right? So that you have to, and he sort of explains the mechanism of that, what that means for people actually sort of internalizing or for the sort of stickiness of whatever the content being repeated.
So, are we going to rename this the David Graeber Reading Group?
I know, huh?
Well, I think too, if I recall, I want to say it's the Mali, where there's a group in Africa that makes decisions. And they'll make a statement, and then everyone in the group it goes around in a circle, and everyone repeats what they thought they heard, or their variation of it. And then after everyone has spoken that idea, then they can either accept it or reject it based on. And it's a very minimalistic sort of debate, like, oh, I heard you say this. So it's kind of like a game of telephone. But it's also telephone played in a circle where you hear what everyone says, and then you use that. So
Greek democracy.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So in the context of what's going on in the messages, Oh, thanks, Eric. I will look that up. University administrators. Is that in the context of the Democracy Project or Bullshit
Yeah,
Jobs?
Democracy Project. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, it should be the Graeber reading group. The Graeber, I mean, maybe as a little memorial can have a.
Hey, I have a question yet, and I've been looking for a chance to bring it up. It resulted from kind of reading White Trash and some of the wacko, uh, since obviously disproven concepts held by the founding fathers. Reading that while then listening to the Supreme Court argument on guaranteed immunity. Not just was that somewhere in the Constitution, but a great interest in, since that obviously it'd be hard to find, or it'd be like a Rorschach test. You could find it there, see it there if you wanted to. But the interest in historical accounts of someone heard this person say that and put it in a letter. So this is the closest we can come to knowing what the founding fathers thought. That combination to me is interesting because what we don't seem to consider in a lot of these court cases is the flawed understanding of reality that founding fathers obviously exhibit. How can you base a country and its rules on perceptions at a time when the understanding of science and all kinds of things was just obviously wrong? And yet we're worried about what somebody said. I don't get that. I mean, I understand the literalist interpretation of the Constitution, and it's more than that though, because now we're, all of this testimony. I don't know if any of you listened to that.
Not that particular,
It was.
Yeah,
it's just illogical and mind-boggling.
It's kind of an article of faith, though, isn't it? That we understand the minds of these, or that this particular group of chosen interpreters,
right? The chosen
accurately
ones
understands the minds of the founders.
Science.
Well, you could make the argument too that they say all men are created equal,
right?
But if you're giving it an originalist interpretation,
it's right
you
there.
You have to totally be crazy MAGA, let's go make America great again. Like, they meant men and only men and not women.
Right.
And they meant the landed gentry. They didn't mean
the
African American slave.
And that women are breeders and everything, out of this chapter. Clearly we disagree. And in some
cases, the census
be completely unscientific, if you will.
Your census had and 3/5 of a man, not 3/5 of a woman slave, just a men's slave.
But even why historically that was the case, it was because without counting them anything, we didn't have enough people to do something else. It's like the whole thing is made up. I mean.
And that's the thing is, and Pat's question in the chat, who says the founders were infallible?
Right.
Well, I think my answer to that question is a lot of people when it suits them, and then not so much when it's not convenient.
It goes back to your notion of obsidian graphs. You got a whole bunch of stuff there. And you don't have to pull it all together. You just need to find a couple things here and there that support an argument. And the point is, well, it's not really an argument because it's a conversation among a certain number of individuals that have been politically put there
And it was
seems
completely contextual too, right?
right.
They're
Yeah.
responding. I mean, they talk, they're always going on and on about Adams and Jefferson and their,
Right, right,
famous,
right, right.
historic disagreements about, who the
So I always
people
wonder with
are.
historians I mean, people who study this period, I don't know what they think of this.
Well,
I guess that's what my question would be. I don't know,
yeah.
but if I read stuff like this, it would lead me to be extremely skeptical of anyone's decision making and truth putting in stone or whatever you call this.
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem logical.
I'd have to dig through my notes to find it, but there are one or two of the Federalist Papers that were totally glossed over when they came out, and no one cared, no one wrote about them. They just were totally sidelined at the time.
Yeah.
That was what's his name? Kevin,
Was it, yeah, Kevin,
whatever the hell. Yeah.
we read it. But now those things are becoming foundational
Yep.
modern texts
Yep.
that are being paid more attention to because they serve a certain agenda for the Republican Party in particular.
Yep.
Or let's say, for example, no one would dispute the fact that Benjamin Franklin was a founding father.
Mhm.
Yet in his lifetime, he published and rewrote portions of tracts from England that literally gave home remedies for pregnancy and that were abortifacients,
Mhm.
and published them in great numbers
Yep.
and put them out this was a thing.
Mhm.
Yet somehow we want to look back at originalist interpretations of the Constitution and say, nope, abortion, not historically a thing in America.
Right.
That wasn't part of our fabric. It's not now. It's never going to be. So we're just going to throw it all out.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah,
I think that,
here's the founding father literally writing a recipe. Here's how you do it.
yep. I think Eisenberg herself is I don't want to go so far as to say guilty of this, but shows examples of this kind of, sort of slight cherry picking, to support a kind of an argument and a narrative arc and a through line. And I think that everybody does that. I mean, it's interesting in historiography, when you're a history grad student, you deal with that, to an extent, right? There are arguments that it's sort of more acceptable to be aware of, how people came up on different sides of this, like the transition, to the market economy, right? There's, that's a relatively safe one, really. But these other ones, these ones that you're talking about, Chris, that really kind of go to the national identity, are much, they're much more, I think, fraught, and so they're contested sometimes in ways that are sort of kind of between the lines and not sort of stated explicitly that this is what I'm saying. And actually the market transition itself can be seen as one of those things, because it can be about, sort of, I mean, there's a Marxist American historian named Alan Kulikoff down in South Carolina, I think. He's probably retired now, who actually believed that that the frontier was actually someplace that people went to escape the market, and that whole logic, but not only the logic of the market, but sort of the social context that it created, in the colonies, in the settled parts of the colonies, and then in the more settled parts of the US in the days of the early republic. And so that's certainly, I mean, and he's a social historian, so that certainly has, so that's the argument that he's talking about, without really, while arguing about, facts and figures and data about, the transitions of markets, and the shift from, account book to cash-based accounting and things like that. That's the, in the background, that's the argument that's being had. And I do think that historians need to kind of be much more explicit about that and call these things, out in language that regular people can understand. And, to some extent, Howard Zinn did that. And that was his big, that was his big value add and his crime as far as the historical profession was concerned, right? That he, and he, and obviously he, picked his data points and drew his, narrative arc through them and, and can be, accused of, of deliberately highlighting some things and not talking about other things, just like everybody else can. So yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. Or that you've got such an information glut, there's so much to know, and you can't possibly know it all. And even worse, the human crime is, I'm almost 50, and I know as much as most people could possibly know. I'm incredibly well educated. I read way more, and I remember, I think, way more than any of my peers do. But I'm going to die, and it's my 13-year-old kid now who has started from scratch and is trying to relearn that. And it's going to take her until she's 50, if she's lucky, to read and see and know everything I know. And it's not going to happen. So every minute we're starting from scratch to try and re-know and relearn, and those lessons need to.
Right. And can you hone that message of your findings to, to sort of a subset of all the data that can be meaningful to her in a way that can, that can give her a leg up, right? Can start her at a step on the ladder or the staircase or whatever, that, that will allow her to, to not have to recapitulate everything, but instead, no, it won't, because writing is thinking, and it's going to prevent us from writing. So we're not going to be doing any thinking.
But the thing that is clearly for this group is at some point we hand over our commonplace books to our impedimenta, and or they get access to our digital copy. Are they written well enough to mean that 55 years is only going to be 10? I don't think so.
Yeah.
Right?
History
Well, it's going to be suggestive. I mean,
If-
hopefully it'll be suggestive enough that people will, will check your notes, and the ones that you've surfaced, right, of the universe of notes that you've taken, the ones that, that were important enough to you to be the basis of an argument or a narrative, and then to be cited, right? That's a subset of the universe of notes that you've taken, which, to whatever extent, I think that's what we're all doing, right? In reading and writing and kind of pushing that
but I've still
rock
got
up the hill.
I'm pretty sure I still haven't gone back to some of my earlier readings and rewritten some new notes that includes Plato and the hitchhiker, not the hitchhiker, the art of motorcycle maintenance, for instance, that I'm sure, because of its place in time and the way it was being pushed, we've probably all read, right? But I don't think, I'm pretty sure my kids haven't, and I'm pretty sure also my kids haven't bothered to read Fountainhead either.
Yeah.
But
to whatever
at some point, what we say is on our bookshelves and is in our notes, at some point makes an influence in terms of, particularly in Chris's case, to the 13-year-old going on 14. That makes her, very close by the time, not this election, but the next one after comes around. We're on the verge of voting, right?
Yeah. Well,
Depending on exactly when the
so your
birthdays
job
fall.
then, Tim, is to make it interesting enough that somebody is going to want to say, "Oh, if that influenced Tim, if the Fountainhead influenced Tim in this way,
Yeah.
and it's showing up, 20 or 30 years
But
later,
how?
him
But
having to
but
write
how
notes about it,
much? But
then
how
maybe
much do
I
you
want to
need?
know a little bit more about that."
But how much do you need to write in such a way that they then don't need to go back and spend that 50 years looking at the originals?
Well,
Whether the original need is a secondary or a primary source in your language terms.
How much do we need to know Da Vinci's source material?
Here's another good example too.
So I'm not yet.
Michelangelo, you don't need to know anything, but Da Vinci, you need to know a lot, I think.
But here's the issue: is you can misread a thing dramatically, and as a massive case in point, we have texts from 600 BCE up to 2nd, 3rd century AD that have been aggregated into a book popularly known as the Bible that I would submit is probably one of the dramatically most misread and misapplied texts in human history. And almost no one today reads it outside of a small group of academics, reads it in its original historical context. Yet instead they read it as, oh, this book was written for me by God, and I'm going to reinterpret it as it suits me in modern 21st century America. And you can go horribly, horribly wrong doing that. It's, and you can, there's enough words in there, you can read it to mean almost anything you want. In fact, just as
it's possible with that, it's possible with anything.
A small point, Robert Alter in his new kind of retranslation of it since the early 2000s takes the word in Hebrew for kind of breath or soul. He takes the word breath for breathing, and that has then been retranslated into the idea of a soul in within Christianity, but it's a misreading of a translation that probably never existed yet. So suddenly we have this new idea of, oh, I have a soul, when really I think what the original text was saying was, I'm a living, breathing thing. I have a life force in me, and not a soul. But yet that idea of soul has become a dramatically different thing for almost all of Western culture versus the original culture that had that idea. And it's 10 o'clock.
And it is. And so meaning is constructed gradually. And not necessarily based on the original intention of the author.
Or as Tim's example earlier, Hayek's words were repurposed and kind of go against his own ideas.
Yep.
As we've seen. So
yeah. Well, cool. So then the plan is for next week we will read shall we say the first section of the Capital Order?
Yeah. 120 odd pages. That should be fine.
Right. And then we'll decide how much of the next batch to tackle. And then I like the idea of either maybe a return to a great booksy thing, and then the next project, or straight on to the Graeber Democracy Project. Either one would work for me, but we can continue discussing that. All right. Good talk today. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
See ya.